Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Round 5 of the Tata Steel Masters, and I'm going to take you through an epic encounter between Richard Rapport, 25 years old, from Hungary. He's now into the top 10 in the world, and his opponent here, Praggnanandhaa from India, 16 years old, a real prodigy. And I think it's fantastic that he's been given a place in the Tata Steel Masters. It's clear that he has a great future ahead of him and, well, so far doing pretty well. 2 out of 4 going into this game. Rapport had 2.5 out of 4, but Praggnanandhaa in the previous round won a really nice game. So, very exciting. Rapport, really creative player, and you know, he's always shown promise, always shown creativity. He feels like he's been on the scene for a very long time, but you know, Rapport now, as I said, coming into the top 10 in the world, which is great to see. He's not just being creative, but he's getting the results as well. So it's a Nimzo Indian, and this line with Queen c2 and playing a3 at a very early stage. I mean, this is a very ambitious line in some ways because, you know, White is not bothering about kingside development, but just wants to grab the 2 bishops. So there we go. Those 2 bishops playing against bishop and knight. d5 and bishop g5, which can be a bit annoying for black because, of course, there's no bishop on e7 to break that pin. The normal move here, or I should say the most popular continuation, is just to take here and play b6. And black gets quick activity like this, but Rapport has a lot of experience with that line already. But instead of that, Praggnanandhaa played instead c5. Well, this has been seen before, and it also leads to extremely sharp positions after this. d4, so it's a pawn sacrifice, but the queen gets pushed around. Previously we've seen here queen c2, Carlsen has played queen f3, but Rapport likes to go his own way. He played queen g3, but he spent 10 minutes over this move. You know, I find that interesting. There's this sort of assumption that the top players, you know, are prepared to the nines and kind of are just sort of playing variations by rote. But in my experience, often the players are kind of working it out at the board. They have, you know, a lot of preparation in their heads, but when they see what's on the board, sometimes they just do things a little bit differently, or they're surprised. And Praggnanandhaa was also taking his time. Knight d7. And Rapport thought for 18 minutes over knight f3, e5, and here, well, the computer likes either e3 or castle's queenside, but after 6 minutes, Rapport played rook d1. Really interesting. As I said, he likes to go his own way. It's kind of tempting to castle queenside, but the king could be a bit drafty on that side of the board, no matter what the computer says. So rook d1, rook e8 looks logical to support this pawn. b4 protects that extra pawn. The problem is a5, and I have to say this looks really scary for white because black is getting lots of activity just by opening up the a file. The rook will come down. But Rapport, he obviously sort of calculated this out. Exchange of pawns, and here, well, Pragg, after 20 minutes thought, played king f8, which I have to say looks like a very odd move to me, because it sort of hesitates, but not just that. I don't think the king is on a very good square on f8. I mean, obviously the king is stepping out of the line here, but still, the machine likes e4 and thinks that black actually stands better. I mean, it's actually, I would say, very unclear after this. And there's one very interesting line you can give up a piece with white like this and just get castled. So white has 3 pawns for a piece and activity. I mean, who knows what's going on there. So anyway, e4 looks like a better move. King f8 just feels a bit weird to me, I have to say. And e4 is possible here. The machine's like e4, and I have to say it looks like a pretty natural move to me to sort of block out black's pieces, black's pawns. But instead queen b3 played. I guess that does cover the a file. It's just very unclear, very strange position. h6 pushes the bishop. Now e4 and e3. And here Pragg plays d3 to prevent the bishop from developing, which is sort of very understandable. You know, it seems difficult for white to develop, but actually knight e5 keeps options open and looks like a better response. If pawn takes pawn, then this is tremendously strong. Check. And that's fatal. Of course, white doesn't need to play there, but this looks like a scary position. But Pragg played d3, which it does look very tempting. As I said, the bishop can't develop. But Rapport incredibly finds a way to sort of make sense of his position. So the bishop comes here. As I said, I didn't think much of that move, king f8. It just looked a bit weird to me. Queen b2, excellent move. Hitting that knight. Queen e7, and now just rook a1. So clearly that was why Rapport wanted to bring the queen over to this side of the board. You know, he wanted to counter this rook on the a file. In exchange, well, I'm sure Rapport, you know, that's the idea. Basically, he's happy to exchange pieces. And if that knight moves, well, a graphic illustration of why the king is perhaps not best placed on f8. Bishop f5 played, which guards that pawn, of course, and that's important because it's guarding that one. But Rapport was now able to exchange pieces, so they've reached an endgame. So we're into the next phase of the game. They've skipped the middle game, and we're into an endgame now, and it's still highly unclear. You know, you have to ask yourself, how exactly is white getting these pieces into the game? White is a pawn up. There is potential much later on to use those 3 pawns on the queen side, but well, you've got to develop. So how does white get away with this? First of all, g4, and then bishop g2. Okay, that's a pretty good start, because now these 2 pieces look at the pawn on e4, and white perhaps can look to castle to bring the rook into play. But watch what happens now. Rook e8. So the rook wants to swing round here to get activity. Okay, over to you. How would you play here if you had white? White to play. What should white do? And this is where Richard came up with an excellent plan. The natural move here is to castle kingside. But after rook a8, black has tremendous activity. Hits the knight. Remember, that pawn, of course, isn't running away. Beautifully supported. And that rook can hit the knight. It can also come to b2 or c2 to make sure those pawns aren't going too far. And of course the king can step over as well to guard those pawns. So castles is a mistake actually, because the king is too far away. Rapport found knight b1. He played that move very, very quickly. After he'd exchanged into the endgame, he bashed out these moves. Knight b1 is a superb move. And now watch what happens if the rook comes over. This didn't happen. But you can see that, well, if there's a check, then the king steps up, the rook is guarded. And after rook a3, king here, this is completely different to when the king is on g1. These pieces now beautifully placed, and if rook b3, rook b1 exchanges rooks, or wants to exchange rooks, and, well, white should be winning that position because the king will step up, the knight will come here, and the king can support the queenside pawns, and the knight is a beautiful blockade on d2, as we're going to see. So knight b1 just played, knight d7 played, king d2. So the king basically stays in the middle, and after this, king c3, another excellent move. If knight c3, in this case, knight e5 is really powerful, and that pawn on c4 can't be defended. So king c3 had to be played, but this is strong. After rook a2, it looks scary. This rook really active. And if knight d2, then rook c2 check wins, check and then wins the knight. But instead, Rapport played rook d1. He'd obviously decided on this a long time ago because he was, at this point, you know, his last few moves have been very quick. This is a great move. He just gives up the pawn on f2, but he finds his feet. And basically with these pieces here, there's no danger. This pawn is not dangerous. The rook is not dangerous. The rook either has to exchange, and that's fine. These pieces hit the pawn, and suddenly, I mean, white is in complete control here. And you know, you can push the queenside pawns. It might even be better to play b5 straight away and then run the king through here. But okay, it's a very pleasant choice for white. So Praggnanandhaa decided to duck the endgame and played rook f6. But the king stepped forward. This is really nice, making way for the knight coming here. Or before I talk about this knight, just let's have a look at this rook. This black rook here, there's probably a bit too much paint on the board, but it's gone from e5 to e8 to a8 to a2 to f2, back to f6, and then back to e6, back to the e file. An incredible tour, winning a pawn, but actually Rapport's handled it brilliantly and has maintained control in the position with this, well, beautiful sequence of moves actually. So yeah, the king stepped to d4 and made room for the knight to come to c3. I mean, fantastic. The king is leading the line here in this complex position, but it can get away with it because, well, there's no dark square bishop for a start. But yeah, black's pieces aren't set up to attack the king, and the king is beautifully placed, supporting those pawns. Knight f6, defending the e pawn, but now b5. And those pawns are starting to roll. And it's very unfortunate for black's king. Of course, it would like to step over here to cover the advance. But if king e7, knight d5 check is absolutely crushing. Of course, if that's taken, then pawn takes looks even worse. And if king d7, the exchange, and then bishop e4. Winning for white. These pawns disappear. And similar happens on king e8. Knight e5 also very, very strong, looking at knight c7, etc. So king g7 played, and that's very unfortunate. I mean, there really isn't anything better. White could play knight d5 here, but Rapport decides to activate the rook instead. And this is a desperate position for black. Pragg went for counterplay on the king side. And it's a good sort of randomizer. Let's see. Bishop f5. He wants to keep hold of this pawn rather than take here. Okay, if rook a7. I mean, you've got to watch out for this pawn. So rook b2 instead. So that's perhaps preparing to play c6 and b6. King h6, but now the king has moved, so Pragg looking to get counterplay, moving the king down. But rook f2 is clever. Once this king has moved, because there's vulnerable pieces here. It's actually possible to sack the exchange here and then take on e4, but, well, knight d5 played very quickly. Knight takes h5 and rook takes f7. The rook breaks through. And the only source of counterplay is the d pawn. So the knight has to step back, covering the d1 square. Knight g3. And still possible for white to go wrong here. For example, if rook takes b7, knight e2, check, is embarrassing. If knight takes, then you make a queen. And king here, check, and you make a queen that way as well. So here, instead of taking Rapport, well, again, he played this one very, very quickly. Knight d1, a solid blockade, and actually it's very difficult for black to do anything here. Pragg tried. Let's have a look. Check, and rook back. King d6, the king marching forward. This is fantastic. And rook d7. So basically, Rapport is making sure that he can pick up that d pawn. It's still tricky. Knight f4. And if takes, well, it still gets a bit messy here. But good calculation. King c7 gives up the bishop in order to take that d pawn. So we've got a situation where Pragg is a pawn up, but that knight is, well, takes time to get into the right position. But the important thing is that at the other end of the board, white is left with this beautiful clump of passed pawns just edging down the board, and there's not a lot that black can do about it. I mean, Rapport had to play this carefully, but it's not too difficult. Knight b2. Pragg declines the exchange, but it doesn't make much difference. Rook d8, just moving in now. Check. And that b pawn just wants to advance. g4, takes, and b6, followed by b7. And one, or possibly even both of those pawns are rolling through. There's nothing that Praggnanandhaa can now do in the position, so he resigned. Wow, I mean, what a game. Such creativity from both players, actually. You know, Pragg found some excellent resources to really test his opponent, and Rapport was up for it. I think, you know, there's a few key moments in the game, but I think it's this one which is very, very clever from Rapport. He judged before he got to this position that casting was a mistake, but he needed to play knight b1 to regroup and keep his king in the middle. So let's have a look at the standings before we go. The other decisive game today was Shahriar Mamedyarov, who defeated Jan Krzysztof Duda. So we have three players on 3.5. We have Mamedyarov, Vidit and Rapport. And a half point behind on 3 out of 5, Yesipenko and Carlsen. Carlsen only drew with Grandelius today. Amazing fight, actually. I could have shown you that one. It was a good one. Let's have a quick look at the pairings for tomorrow. Let me see. That's a good one. We've got Carlsen against Rapport. Carlsen with white. That's going to be interesting. Mamedyarov plays Grandelius. And Vidit plays against Duda. And, well, you can find full details at tatasteelchess.com if you want to check that out. Thanks for watching.